Captain Marcus Rodriguez pressed his back against the concrete wall, feeling the vibrations from the explosions that shook the abandoned factory complex. Dust rained down from the ceiling as another rocket-propelled grenade struck the building's exterior. His radio crackled with urgent reports from his team members scattered throughout the compound. Alpha 2, report, Rodriguez whispered into his headset, wiping sweat and grime from his forehead. We're pinned down in the East Wing, Captain. At least 20 hostiles between us and the extraction point, came the strained voice of Petty Officer Jenkins. They've got us in a crossfire. Rodriguez had been leading SEAL Team 7 for 8 years, through countless operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. He'd earned his reputation as a tactical genius who could turn impossible situations into victories. But this mission in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan felt different. The intelligence had been wrong from the start. What was supposed to be a simple hostage rescue had turned into a nightmare. The terror cell they were hunting had been expecting them. The compound was heavily fortified, the enemy was well armed, and his 12-man team was outnumbered 3-1. The mission had started before dawn. Rodriguez and his team had fast roped from helicopters into what intelligence reports claimed was a lightly defended compound, holding 3 American contractors. The contractors had been kidnapped 2 weeks earlier while working on an infrastructure project in Kabul. But as soon as his boots hit the ground, Rodriguez knew something was wrong. The compound was too quiet. No sentries visible, no movement in the windows. His instincts, honed by hundreds of combat operations, screamed danger. Something's not right, he'd whispered to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Sarah Chun. This feels like a trap. Chun nodded, adjusting her night vision goggles. Should we abort? Rodriguez studied the compound through his scope. 3 buildings arranged in a triangle, with high walls connecting them. Perfect for defense, terrible for assault. But somewhere in those buildings were 3 Americans whose lives depended on this mission. Negative. We stick to the plan, but stay sharp. The plan had been simple. Alpha Team would breach the main building where intelligence suggested the hostages were held. Bravo Team would secure the perimeter and watch for escape routes. Charlie Team would provide overwatch and sniper support from the ridgeline. For the first 10 minutes, everything went according to plan. Alpha Team cleared the first floor of the main building without resistance. The rooms were empty, but showed recent signs of occupation. Food still warm on plates, beds unmade, weapons cleaned and ready. Then the lights came on. Floodlights blazed from all 3 buildings, turning night into day and destroying their night vision advantage. Machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions, catching Charlie Team exposed on the ridge. Rodriguez watched in horror as 2 of his best snipers were cut down in the first seconds of the ambush. It's a setup, Chun shouted over the gunfire. They knew we were coming. The next hour became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Rodriguez's team found themselves trapped inside the compound, with enemies in prepared positions firing down at them from elevated positions. The thick walls that were meant to keep intruders out now kept the SEALs in. Rodriguez had called for immediate extraction, but the helicopters couldn't land under heavy fire. The nearest friendly forces were 2 hours away. His team was on their own. Bravo leader, what's your status? Rodriguez called into his radio. We're in the workshop building, came the reply from Chief Petty Officer Davis. For men, all wounded but mobile. We've got good cover, but limited ammo. Rodriguez did quick calculations in his head. 12 men scattered across 3 buildings, surrounded by an unknown number of enemies who knew the terrain better than they did. Several wounded, ammunition running low, and no immediate hope of rescue. This was exactly the kind of situation that had ended badly for special operations teams throughout history. But Rodriguez hadn't become a SEAL captain by accepting defeat. All teams, listen up, he broadcast. We're going to consolidate our position and fight our way out. Alpha Team will move to link up with Bravo in the workshop. Charlie survivors will provide covering fire and then fall back to join us. Sir, that's a lot of open ground to cross, Jenkins replied. They've got overlapping fields of fire. Rodriguez studied the compound layout in his mind. The workshop building was the most defensible position, with thick concrete walls and limited entry points. If they could get everyone there, they could make a stand until help arrived. We'll use smoke and move in balance. On my mark. Rodriguez pulled 2 smoke grenades from his vest and signaled to Chun and the other Alpha team members. They would have to cross 50 meters of open courtyard while under fire from at least 3 directions. The smoke grenades billowed thick gray clouds across the courtyard. Rodriguez could hear the enemy fighters shouting to each other in Pashto, trying to coordinate their fire. But the smoke also masked his team's movement. Go, go, go! Rodriguez sprinted across the courtyard, his team spread out behind him. Bullets cracked through the air around them, some so close he could feel the heat. A round struck the concrete inches from his feet, sending fragments into his leg. They made it to the workshop building just as the smoke began to clear. Rodriguez counted heads as his men dove through the doorway. Everyone from Alpha Team had made it, though 2 were bleeding from minor wounds. "Good to see you, Captain," Davis said, reloading his rifle. "Though I wish it was under better circumstances." The workshop was exactly what Rodriguez had hoped for. Concrete block construction, small windows, and only 2 entry points they needed to defend. Workbenches and heavy machinery provided excellent cover for firing positions. "What's the ammo situation?" Rodriguez asked. Davis grimaced. "Not great. Maybe 40 rounds per man for the rifles, and I've got 2 magazines left for the squad automatic weapon." Rodriguez did the math. Against a determined assault by superior numbers, they might hold out for 20 minutes. After that, it would come down to hand-to-hand combat. "Charlie team, what's your status?" he called into the radio. The response was broken and filled with static. "Charlie leader, 3 men down, falling back, heavy contact." Rodriguez felt the familiar cold knot in his stomach that came with losing men under his command. But he couldn't afford to grieve now. The survivors needed his full attention. Outside, the enemy fire had slackened somewhat. Rodriguez could hear vehicles moving, engines revving, and shouted orders. They were repositioning for an assault on the workshop. "They're going to hit us hard," Chin observed, peering through a crack in the concrete blocks. "I count at least 2 technical vehicles with mounted machine guns, and they're setting up a mortar position behind the main building." Rodriguez nodded. The enemy commander was smart, using his numerical advantage and heavy weapons to maximum effect. A frontal assault supported by mortars and machine guns would likely overwhelm the workshop's defenses. But Rodriguez had one advantage the enemy didn't know about. Before becoming a SEAL, he'd studied military history extensively. He knew that desperate situations often produced unexpected opportunities. "Davis, what kind of equipment is in here?" Rodriguez asked, looking around the workshop. "Looks like a vehicle maintenance facility. Welding equipment, hydraulic lifts, parts storage." Davis paused, understanding dawning in his eyes. "And about 50 gallons of diesel fuel in that tank over there." Rodriguez smiled grimly. "Start rigging charges on that fuel tank. When they come through that door, we're going to give them a surprise they won't forget." As his men prepared the improvised explosive, Rodriguez contacted the command center via satellite radio. "Control, this is Trident 7. We are surrounded and taking heavy casualties. Request immediate air support, danger close." The response came back quickly. "Trident 7, nearest air support is 40 minutes out. Apache helicopters are en route from Bagram, but weather is deteriorating. You may need to hold your position until dawn." 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours. Rodriguez looked at his remaining men, all professionals who understood their situation without needing it explained. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of options. But they were still SEALs. "Listen up," Rodriguez addressed his team. "I won't lie to you about our situation. We're in a tight spot, and some of us might not make it home. But we've trained for this our entire careers. We know how to fight, and we know how to win." The men nodded, checking their weapons and adjusting their positions. Rodriguez saw determination in their faces, not fear. These were the kind of warriors who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. Outside, the enemy was getting closer. Rodriguez could hear boots crunching on gravel, low voices coordinating the attack. They would come soon, probably from multiple directions at once. The first mortar round struck the roof of the workshop, sending chunks of concrete raining down. The building shook, but held. Rodriguez knew they wouldn't be so lucky with a direct hit. Incoming, Chun shouted as another mortar round whistled overhead, this one landing in the courtyard and sending shrapnel against the workshop walls. The mortars were finding their range. The next few rounds would be right on target. Rodriguez made a decision that went against every tactical manual he'd ever studied. Instead of waiting for the enemy to attack, he was going to take the fight to them. New plan, he announced. We're going on the offensive. Davis looked at him with surprise. Sir, we're outnumbered 3-1. That's exactly why they won't expect it, Rodriguez replied. They think we're trapped in here, waiting to be picked off. Instead, we're going to hit their mortar position and fight our way to the extraction zone. It was a desperate gamble, but Rodriguez had learned long ago that sometimes desperate situations required desperate measures. The enemy had positioned their mortar team behind the main building, thinking they were safe from counterattack. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Rodriguez quickly outlined the plan. Chun would lead half the team in a flanking maneuver around the north side of the compound, while Rodriguez led the others straight at the mortar position. The coordinated attack would catch the enemy between two fires and hopefully create enough confusion for the SEALs to break out. What about the fuel tank? Davis asked. Leave it rigged. If anyone follows us into this building, they'll get a nasty surprise. Rodriguez checked his watch. The helicopters were still 35 minutes out, assuming they could land in the deteriorating weather. His team had to survive that long and find a defensible position for extraction. The mortar rounds were coming faster now, walking toward the workshop with deadly precision. The enemy commander was smart, using the mortars to keep the SEALs pinned while his assault teams moved into position. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different positions around the workshop. The enemy had them surrounded, but their positions were spread out to avoid being caught in a single counterattack. That was about to work against them. Remember, speed and aggression, Rodriguez told his men as they prepared to move out. We hit hard and fast, then keep moving. Don't get caught in a prolonged firefight. The next mortar round hit the workshop's east wall, punching a hole through the concrete blocks. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, and Rodriguez felt his ears ringing. That's our cue, he said. Let's go. Rodriguez kicked open the workshop's back door and immediately engaged 2 enemy fighters who had been moving up for the assault. His suppressed rifle coughed twice, and both men dropped without firing a shot. Behind him, his team flowed out of the building like water, spreading out to avoid presenting a concentrated target. They moved with the fluid precision that came from countless hours of training together. The enemy had been focused on the front of the workshop, expecting the SEALs to either surrender or make a desperate break for the main gate. They were completely unprepared for an attack from their rear. Rodriguez's team covered the 50 meters to the main building in less than 30 seconds, using available cover and suppressing fire to avoid the enemy's hasty response. By the time the enemy fighters realized what was happening, the SEALs were already among them. The mortar team was positioned exactly where Rodriguez had expected, behind a main building where they thought they were safe. 3 men operating an 82mm mortar with a stack of ammunition nearby. Rodriguez's first shot took down the gunner. His second dropped the assistant gunner before the man could reach for his rifle. The third man tried to run, but was cut down by Davis's precise fire. Mortar neutralized, Rodriguez reported into his radio. Chin, what's your status? We've engaged the machine gun position. 2 enemy down, but there's another technical moving around to flank us. Rodriguez could see the technical vehicle Chin was talking about, a Toyota pickup with a machine gun mounted in the bed. It was racing around the perimeter of the compound, trying to get into position to support the remaining enemy fighters. But the vehicle's driver had made a tactical error. In his haste to engage Chen's team, he'd driven into Rodriguez's line of fire. Rodriguez dropped to one knee and aimed carefully. The technical was moving fast, bouncing over rough terrain. It would take perfect timing and a lot of luck to disable it with rifle fire. He squeezed the trigger just as the vehicle hit a bump, sending it airborne for a split second. Rodriguez's bullet struck the driver in the chest, and the technical veered sharply to the left before rolling over twice and coming to rest on its side. The machine gunner was thrown clear but didn't get up. Technical down, Rodriguez reported. All teams consolidate on the landing zone. Extraction in 20 minutes. But even as he said it, Rodriguez could hear more vehicles approaching from the south. The enemy commander had called for reinforcements, and they were arriving faster than expected. Rodriguez realized that their fight was far from over. If anything, it was about to get much worse. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, echoing off the mountain walls surrounding the compound. Rodriguez counted at least 3 engines, maybe 4. Through his night vision scope, he could see headlights bouncing along the rough access road that led to the compound. "Looks like we've got company," Chen's voice crackled through the radio. She had reached the landing zone first with her team and was setting up defensive positions. Rodriguez surveyed the tactical situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 8 years of combat operations. His team had successfully neutralized the immediate threats and taken control of the compound, but their ammunition was critically low. Each man had maybe 20 rounds left, not nearly enough for a prolonged engagement with a fresh enemy force. The landing zone was a flat area about 200 meters north of the compound, barely large enough for one helicopter. It was surrounded by rocky outcroppings that provided excellent defensive positions, but also offered concealment for attacking forces. "All teams fall back to the LZ and take defensive positions," Rodriguez ordered. "We'll make our stand there." As his men began their withdrawal, Rodriguez remained behind to set up a nasty surprise for the incoming reinforcements. The workshop's fuel tank was still rigged with explosives, and the main building had several structural weak points that could be exploited. Rodriguez placed his last 2 fragmentation grenades at strategic choke points, rigging them with tripwires that would detonate when the enemy fighters entered the compound. It wouldn't stop them, but it might slow them down and reduce their numbers. The approaching vehicles were close enough now that Rodriguez could distinguish individual engines. 3 pickup trucks, probably carrying at least 15 fighters. Combined with the survivors from the original garrison, the enemy force would number at least 25 men. Rodriguez checked his watch. 15 minutes until the extraction helicopters were scheduled to arrive, assuming they could make it through the worsening weather. He could hear thunder rumbling in the distance, and the wind was picking up. He sprinted toward the landing zone, keeping low and using the terrain for cover. Behind him, the first of the enemy vehicles entered the compound. Rodriguez heard the satisfying explosion of one of his booby traps, followed by shouting and automatic weapons fire. The landing zone was a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, with steep walls on 3 sides and the approach road on the 4th. Chen had positioned her men along the high ground, giving them excellent fields of fire down into the valley. "What's the situation?" Rodriguez asked as he slid into position beside Chen. "We've got good cover and excellent visibility," Chen reported. "But if they get heavy weapons up on those ridges, they can rain fire down on us from above." Rodriguez studied the terrain with a professional eye. Chen was right. The landing zone was defensible against ground assault, but vulnerable to indirect fire from the surrounding heights. If the enemy had mortars or rocket-propelled grenades, they could make the extraction point untenable. "Davis, take 3 men and secure that ridge to the east," Rodriguez ordered. "Don't let them establish a firing position up there." Davis nodded and selected his team, disappearing into the darkness with the fluid movement of experienced operators. Rodriguez knew that every man counted now. They were playing for time, hoping to hold out until the helicopters arrived. The first enemy fighters appeared at the edge of the landing zone, 5 minutes later. They moved cautiously, having learned respect for the SEALs' capabilities. Rodriguez could see them probing for weaknesses, testing his defensive positions. "Wait for my signal," Rodriguez whispered into his radio. "Let them get close." The enemy advanced in small groups, using available cover and coordinating their movement with hand signals. Rodriguez had to admit they were well-trained and disciplined. This wasn't some ragtag militia, but a professional fighting force. When the lead group was within 50 meters of the American positions, Rodriguez gave the order to fire. The hillside erupted with muzzle flashes as the SEALs engaged the enemy fighters. Rodriguez's careful positioning paid off immediately. The enemy was caught in a crossfire with no good cover and nowhere to retreat. But the enemy commander was smart. Instead of pressing a frontal assault, he pulled his men back and began moving them around the flanks. Rodriguez watched through his scope as teams of fighters began climbing the steep slopes on either side of the landing zone. "They're trying to get above us," Chin observed, tracking one group of climbers with a rifle scope. Rodriguez made rapid calculations. His men could probably hold the high ground against a frontal assault, but they didn't have enough ammunition for a prolonged firefight on multiple fronts. "We need to break their momentum before they get established," Rodriguez decided. "Chun, take 2 men and intercept that group on the west slope. I'll handle the east side." It was a risky move, splitting his already small force, but Rodriguez knew that losing control of the high ground would be fatal. Better to take the fight to the enemy while they were still climbing. Rodriguez selected Petty Officer Martinez and Seaman Williams to accompany him up the eastern slope. Both men were experienced climbers and excellent shots, exactly what he needed for this mission. They moved up the rocky slope with careful speed, using natural cover to avoid detection. Rodriguez could hear the enemy fighters above them, their boots dislodging stones as they climbed. The eastern slope was treacherous terrain, with loose rock and steep gradients that made quiet movement almost impossible. But Rodriguez's team had the advantage of night vision and superior training. They intercepted the enemy climbing team just as they reached a natural ledge that would have given them an excellent firing position down into the landing zone. Rodriguez counted 5 fighters, all armed with automatic rifles and carrying extra ammunition. Rodriguez signaled for his men to spread out and wait for his signal. The enemy fighters were focused on the climbing ahead of them and hadn't noticed the Americans moving up behind them. Rodriguez's shot dropped the lead climber instantly. Martinez and Williams engaged simultaneously, catching the enemy fighters completely by surprise. In less than 10 seconds, all 5 enemy fighters were neutralized, but the gunfire had given away their position. Rodriguez could hear shouts from below as the enemy commander redirected his forces to deal with this new threat. "We need to move," Rodriguez told his men. "They'll be coming up after us." The 3 SEALs began a tactical withdrawal down the slope, using bounds and covering fire to avoid being pinned down. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as the enemy tried to bracket their movement with automatic weapons fire. A bullet struck the rock inches from Rodriguez's head, sending fragments into his cheek. He felt warm blood running down his face, but ignored it, focused entirely on getting his men back to the defensive perimeter. They made it back to the landing zone, just as Chin's team returned from their own flanking mission. Rodriguez could see from their grim expressions that they had been successful, but at a cost. "Williams took a round in the shoulder," Chin reported. "He's still mobile, but losing blood." Rodriguez quickly assessed Williams' wound. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his shoulder without hitting bone or major blood vessels. Painful, but not life-threatening. "Can you still fight?" Rodriguez asked. Williams nodded, gritting his teeth as Chon applied a field dressing to the wound. "Yes, sir. I'm good to go." Rodriguez checked his watch. 7 minutes until the extraction helicopters were scheduled to arrive. But he could see lightning flashing in the clouds, and the wind was gusting strong enough to make helicopter operations extremely dangerous. His radio crackled with an incoming transmission. Trident 7, this is Nighthawk 3-1. We're 5 minutes out, but weather is deteriorating rapidly. We may not be able to land if conditions get worse. Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. If the helicopters couldn't land, his team would be stranded on the mountainside with a superior enemy force, and no ammunition for a prolonged fight. Understood, Nighthawk. We'll mark the LZ with infrared strobes. Rodriguez turned to his men, seeing his own concerns reflected in their faces. They all understood the situation. If the helicopters couldn't extract them, their only option would be to fight their way out on foot through miles of hostile territory. But before Rodriguez could address his team, the enemy launched their next assault. This time, they came from all directions simultaneously. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from the compound below, the ridges on both sides, and even from positions behind the landing zone that they must have reached by climbing around through the darkness. Contact on all sides, Shin shouted into her radio. We're surrounded. Rodriguez quickly redistributed his men to cover all approaches, but he knew they couldn't hold out long against a coordinated assault from multiple directions. His team was down to their last few magazines, and several men were wounded. The enemy fire was intense and accurate, forcing the SEALs to keep their heads down while enemy fighters maneuvered closer to their positions. Rodriguez could hear commands being shouted in Pashto as the enemy commander coordinated the final assault. Then Rodriguez heard the sound he'd been hoping for, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors cutting through the mountain air. Nighthawk 3-1, this is Trident 7. We are in contact and need immediate support on the LZ, Rodriguez called in his radio. Copy, Trident 7. We can see your position. We're going to make one pass to suppress the enemy, then land for extraction. Be ready to move fast. The lead Apache helicopter came in low and fast, its 30mm chain gun blazing. Rodriguez watched as enemy positions around the landing zone disappeared in explosions of dirt and shrapnel. The second Apache circled wider, using its Hellfire missiles to destroy the enemy vehicles in the compound below. The suppressing fire bought Rodriguez's team the precious seconds they needed. As soon as the enemy fire slackened, Rodriguez signaled for his men to move toward the landing zone. The extraction helicopter, a modified Black Hawk, came in hard and fast despite the worsening weather. The pilot was fighting strong crosswinds and limited visibility, but he managed to bring the aircraft down on the makeshift landing zone. Go, 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 Rodriguez shouted as his men sprinted toward the helicopter. Chun and her team reached the aircraft first, providing covering fire as the wounded were loaded aboard. Rodriguez counted heads as each man reached safety, feeling the familiar weight of command responsibility. Davis and his team were the last to reach the helicopter, with Rodriguez providing rearguard security. As the final SEAL climbed aboard, Rodriguez prepared to follow. That's when he saw the enemy fighter. The man had somehow gotten within grenade range of the helicopter, and Rodriguez could see the distinctive shape of an RPG on his shoulder. One shot from that weapon would destroy the helicopter and kill everyone aboard. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. Instead of climbing into the helicopter, he sprinted toward the enemy fighter, his rifle blazing. He covered the 30 meters between them in seconds, but the fighter was already aiming his weapon. The two men fired simultaneously. Rodriguez felt the bullet tear through his vest, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. But his own shots had found their mark. The enemy fighter collapsed, his RPG round flying wild and exploding harmlessly against the mountainside. Rodriguez lay on the rocky ground, feeling warm blood spreading across his chest. He could hear his men shouting, the helicopter engines spooling up for takeoff. Go, he managed to shout. Get out of here. But even as the words left his mouth, Rodriguez saw something that changed everything. On the ridge above the landing zone, he spotted the distinctive muzzle flash of a sniper rifle. The shooter was positioned perfectly to target the helicopter as it lifted off. Rodriguez realized with crystal clarity that his team wasn't safe yet. That one shot could still turn their successful extraction into a disaster. Rodriguez struggled to his feet, fighting through the pain and blood loss. He raised his rifle and took careful aim at the distant muzzle flash. It would be the most important shot of his career. The sniper fired first. Rodriguez watched in horror as the bullet struck the helicopter's tail rotor, sending metal fragments spinning through the air. The aircraft lurched violently to one side as the pilot fought to maintain control. Rodriguez steadied his rifle and fired. Through his scope, he saw the enemy sniper jerk backward and disappear from view. But the damage was already done. The helicopter was losing altitude rapidly, auto-rotating toward a crash landing on the mountain slope. Rodriguez keyed his radio with trembling fingers. Nighthawk 3-1, this is Trident 7. You have wounded on board and are going down. Request immediate medical evacuation. As he spoke, Rodriguez could see enemy fighters emerging from cover throughout the area. They had witnessed the helicopter crash and were moving to capture or kill the survivors. Rodriguez checked his ammunition. 3 rounds left in his magazine, with no spares remaining. Against an unknown number of enemy fighters, it wouldn't be nearly enough. But Rodriguez wasn't thinking about odds or tactical situations anymore. His men were down there, wounded and trapped. Some of them might be unconscious or unable to defend themselves. Rodriguez began moving down the slope toward the crash site. He wasn't leaving his team behind, no matter what the cost. As he moved through the darkness, Rodriguez realized that this mission was far from over. In fact, the most dangerous part might just be beginning. Rodriguez moved down the rocky slope with methodical precision despite the burning pain in his chest. Each step sent fresh waves of agony through his wounded torso, but he forced himself to maintain tactical discipline. His men needed him, and nothing else mattered. The helicopter had crashed about 300 meters down the slope, coming to rest against a cluster of large boulders. Rodriguez could see the aircraft's twisted fuselage in the moonlight, with debris scattered across a wide area. Worse, he could see movement around the crash site, enemy fighters converging on the downed aircraft. Rodriguez checked his rifle one more time. 3 rounds remaining. He would have to make each shot count. As he worked his way closer to the crash site, Rodriguez could hear voices coming from inside the helicopter. His men were alive, but some sounded injured. He also heard enemy fighters calling to each other as they surrounded the wreckage. Rodriguez found an overwatch position behind a large rock outcropping about 50 meters from the crash site. From there, he had a clear view of the helicopter and the enemy fighters moving around it. Through his scope, Rodriguez counted at least 8 enemy fighters. They were being cautious, probably expecting the Americans to be armed and dangerous despite the crash. But they were also moving with the confidence of hunters closing in on wounded prey. Rodriguez watched as 3 enemy fighters approached the helicopter's main cabin door. Inside, he could see Chun trying to organize a defense with the uninjured members of his team. But several SEALs appeared to be unconscious or seriously wounded from the crash. The enemy fighters reached the helicopter and began shouting demands in broken English. Rodriguez could make out enough to understand they were ordering his men to surrender their weapons and come out with their hands raised. Rodriguez knew his team would never surrender. They would fight to the last round and the last man. But in their current condition, that fight wouldn't last long. Rodriguez made his decision. He lined up his scope on the nearest enemy fighter and squeezed the trigger. The man dropped instantly, struck in the center of his chest. Before his body hit the ground, Rodriguez had already shifted to his second target. The second shot took down another fighter who was positioning himself to fire into the helicopter cabin. 2 rounds left, and the remaining enemy fighters were scrambling for cover. But Rodriguez's intervention had bought his team the few seconds they needed. Chun kicked open the helicopter door and let a desperate breakout from the wreckage. The uninjured SEALs provided covering fire while helping their wounded teammates reach defensive positions behind the scattered debris. Rodriguez used his third and final round to cover their withdrawal, dropping another enemy fighter who was trying to flank Chen's position. Then, his rifle clicked empty. Rodriguez drew his sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226 with one full magazine remaining. 15 rounds against at least 5 remaining enemy fighters. Not great odds, but he'd worked with worse. The enemy fighters had taken cover behind rocks and debris, creating a deadly standoff. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes as they exchanged fire with his team, but in the darkness and confusion, it was difficult to assess who had the advantage. Rodriguez knew he had to get closer to be effective with his pistol. The enemy fighters were focused on the helicopter wreckage, giving him an opportunity to flank their positions. He began a careful stalk around the perimeter of the crash site, using available cover to mask his movement. The rocky terrain provided excellent concealment, but it also meant slow going for someone with a chest wound. Rodriguez could feel his strength ebbing with each step. Blood loss and shock were taking their toll, making it difficult to maintain focus. But he forced himself to keep moving, driven by an unbreakable commitment to his team. As he worked around to the enemy's flank, Rodriguez could hear radio chatter from his position. Chen was coordinating the defense of the crash site, keeping the enemy at bay with precise rifle fire. But Rodriguez knew their ammunition wouldn't last much longer. Rodriguez reached a position where he could see 3 enemy fighters positioned behind a large boulder. They were focused entirely on the Americans at the crash site, completely unaware of his presence. Rodriguez steadied his pistol against a rock and took careful aim. At this range, he would have to make every shot count. The first fighter went down with a headshot. The second turned toward the sound but caught Rodriguez's second bullet in the chest. The third fighter managed to return fire, but his shots went wide in the darkness. Rodriguez's third shot ended the threat. With 3 more enemy fighters eliminated, the balance of the engagement had shifted dramatically. Rodriguez could hear Chen calling out targets as the remaining enemy fighters began to withdraw. "Rodriguez, where the hell are you?" Chen's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Flanking position, 200 meters west of the crash site," Rodriguez replied. How many casualties do we have?" "Davis is unconscious with a head injury. Martinez has a broken leg. William's shoulder is torn up pretty bad, but he's still fighting. The rest of us are mobile with minor injuries." Rodriguez felt relief wash over him. His team had survived the crash in better condition than he'd feared. But they were still trapped on a mountainside with limited ammunition and no immediate hope of extraction. "The enemy is pulling back, but they'll be calling for reinforcements," Rodriguez analyzed. "We need to find a more defensible position and signal for another extraction." Rodriguez made his way to the crash site, where Chen immediately began treating his chest wound. The bullet had passed through his left lung without hitting major organs, but he was losing blood steadily. "You need a hospital, Captain," Chen said as she applied pressure dressings to both the entry and exit wounds. "We all need a hospital," Rodriguez replied, looking at his battered team. "But first we need to get off this mountain." Rodriguez studied their tactical situation with professional detachment. The helicopter was a total loss, providing no shelter or resources. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and several team members were seriously injured. The enemy would undoubtedly return with reinforcements, probably within the hour. But Rodriguez had one advantage the enemy didn't know about. During his reconnaissance of the area before the mission, he had identified an alternative extraction site about 2 kilometers north of their current position. It was a natural clearing that could accommodate helicopters, defensible against ground assault, and accessible by foot even with wounded personnel. "We're going to move to the secondary extraction site," Rodriguez announced to his team. "It's a hard trek with casualties, but it's our best chance." Rodriguez called the command center on his satellite radio. "Control, this is Trident 7. Primary extraction failed due to enemy action. Moving to secondary site for alternate pickup. Request immediate medical evacuation for multiple wounded." The response came back quickly. "Trident 7, we copy. Weather is clearing, and We have another flight of helicopters en route. Estimated arrival at secondary site is 45 minutes. 45 minutes to cover 2 kilometers of mountainous terrain with wounded teammates while being pursued by hostile forces. Rodriguez had faced impossible odds before, but this was pushing the limits even for a SEAL team. Rodriguez organized his men for movement. Chun and Williams would carry Davis on an improvised stretcher made from helicopter debris. Martinez would be helped by 2 other team members. Rodriguez would walk point despite his own injuries, with the remaining men providing rear security. They began moving north along a barely visible goat trail that Rodriguez had identified during his pre-mission reconnaissance. The path was treacherous in daylight and potentially lethal in darkness, but it was their only option for reaching the extraction site. Rodriguez set a steady pace, fast enough to stay ahead of pursuit, but slow enough to accommodate the wounded. Every few minutes, he called a halt to check on his team and listen for signs of enemy movement behind them. After 30 minutes of hard climbing, Rodriguez could see the extraction site ahead, a natural meadow surrounded by defensive ridges. But he could also hear voices behind them. The enemy had found their trail and was in pursuit. "They're gaining on us," Chen reported from her position at the rear of the column. "I can see lights about 500 meters back." Rodriguez checked his watch. 15 minutes until the extraction helicopters arrived. They would have to hold the extraction site against unknown numbers of enemy fighters with whatever ammunition they had left. Rodriguez deployed his team around the perimeter of the meadow, setting up overlapping fields of fire. With only 8 effective fighters and limited ammunition, they would have to be perfect in their defensive preparations. The enemy appeared at the edge of the meadow, just as Rodriguez heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. But the approaching helicopters were still several minutes out, precious time his team might not have. Rodriguez counted at least 12 enemy fighters, probably more, moving through the darkness. They had learned from their earlier encounters and were approaching cautiously, using available cover and coordinating their movement. "Wait for my signal," Rodriguez whispered into his radio. "Let them commit to the assault before we open fire." The enemy fighters began their advance across the meadow in small groups, moving from cover to cover. Rodriguez waited until they were within 30 meters before giving the order to engage. The SEALs opened fire with devastating precision. Years of training and combat experience showed as each shot found its mark. The enemy advance staggered under the accurate fire, with multiple fighters going down in the first few seconds. But the enemy commander adapted quickly. Instead of withdrawing, he committed his remaining forces to an all-out assault, trying to overwhelm the American positions through sheer numbers and aggression. Rodriguez found himself in a close-range firefight with 3 enemy fighters who had reached his position. His pistol was empty, forcing him to engage with his knife in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The first fighter went down to a knife thrust to the throat. The second caught Rodriguez's blade between his ribs and collapsed without a sound. The third managed to grapple with Rodriguez, both men rolling across the rocky ground in a desperate struggle. Rodriguez's chest wound reopened during the fight, sending fresh blood streaming down his torso. But adrenaline and determination kept him fighting. He managed to break free from his opponent's grip and deliver a killing blow with his knife. Around the perimeter, his team was fighting with equal ferocity. Rodriguez could see Chan engaged in hand-to-hand combat with 2 enemy fighters, while Williams was defending his position despite his wounded shoulder. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, and Rodriguez could see the aircraft's lights approaching through the darkness. But the landing zone was still contested, with enemy fighters holding positions that could threaten the incoming helicopters. Rodriguez made a final desperate decision. Using his remaining strength, he charged the enemy position that posed the greatest threat to the extraction. Rodriguez fought his way through 2 more enemy fighters, taking multiple wounds but clearing a path for the helicopters to land safely. As he collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion, he saw the extraction aircraft touching down in the meadow. His team secured the landing zone and began loading the wounded aboard the helicopters. Rodriguez felt hands lifting him, carrying him towards safety. As the helicopter lifted off from the mountain meadow, Rodriguez looked down at the battlefield where his team had fought for their lives. They had been outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. By every tactical calculation, they should have been overwhelmed. But they had survived because they refused to give up. They had turned a hopeless situation into victory through skill, courage, and an unbreakable commitment to each other. Rodriguez closed his eyes as the helicopter carried his team towards safety, knowing that this mission would be remembered as one of the most remarkable small unit actions in SEAL history. They had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, proving once again that the human spirit could triumph over any adversity. The battle that was supposed to be finished had instead become a testament to the warrior ethos that defined America's Special Operations Forces. One shot had indeed flipped the battle, but it was the collective courage of his team that had won the war.